about digital gaming and how that relates to the rest of society through how we use play throughout media. So we're going to do the same kind of stages that we do for all of our sections. And so this first section is on emergence in digital gaming. So how did technology drive innovation? Where did gaming start? And how do we kind of get it to the point that people were wanting to then take advantage of it through entrepreneurship? So the timeline is going to roughly follow some of the same things that we'll see through the internet, but also other parts of media that we talk about in the following sections, things like image and movies and things like that. So it's kind of the coming together of both the digital aspect of digital gaming, where we're going to look at how the changes to processing power and also the hardware in terms of screens will impact things, but also just the general change in how we as a society use our free time, or if we have free time. So we've got some of the same technological breakthroughs and processors in the 1970s. And also when we think about digital gaming, oftentimes mobile gaming will come into it. And so changes in bandwidth is really going to have a huge impact in the kind of the 90s and 2000s. But also in terms of portability through things like screens. So for around the same time that we've got the changes in microprocessing that we talked about that allowed computers to come into our homes, we had big clunky TVs. So up until the early 2000s, almost all screens are going to be what are called cathode ray tubes, CRTs. You will get laptop screens, you will get thin LCD devices, but they're very, very expensive at this point. And so for your laptop, for example, at least half of the cost of your laptop in the 90s and 2000s is going to be your screen. Because of the fact that the screen itself was, in order to have it not be incredibly heavy and also be thin, it had to be really state-of-the-art, very expensive technology. It's only when we get into the 2000s that CRTs become, start getting phased out, and we start getting LCD, we get plasma, we get different kinds of flat screens becoming cost-effective at larger sizes. And so, for example, when we only just threw out our big CRT that we had still hanging around, we didn't use it in the house, but they're really heavy when you get them large. And they also have a lot of electricity running through them. So this is really going to impact the portability of gaming. So when we've got the emergence, we can actually look back even further before getting into people's houses, but people first interacting with gaming on a kind of larger scale. We have to think about leisure time. We take for granted the fact that we all have free time. But until the Industrial Revolution, nobody really had free time. You was an agrarian society. You got up with the sunrise. You worked all day. You were exhausted. You went to sleep. And actually, in terms of like how we utilize time, it was quite common for people to go to sleep, then wake up in what we consider the middle of the night. And when they'd wake up then, they would go and visit people because you had your rest after having toiled all day. And you go and visit people in the middle of the night, and you go back, you have your second sleep until the dawn. That is not how we operate these days because we have our working day. And so we don't go by the sun, we go by a clock. All of that changed the Industrial Revolution because suddenly we're standardizing things. We want lots of people to come together to work together on the same schedule. But part of that, with that industrialization, mechanization, is that we have free time. So for almost all the media that we look at going forward, we're going to talk about the fact that none of it really started becoming mass media until after that Industrial Revolution. There's no entrepreneurship. You can't sell it to people if they don't have time, they don't have resources in order to consume it. So we start off with the kind of simplest form as an arcade. And from these arcades, we're going to develop into kind of four major formats for digital gaming. Digital games that are going to be on televisions, so that's going to be like console gaming. Handheld devices, so think of things like the Switch and all of its predecessors like the Game Boy. Computer gaming, an example, obviously you can do this on other things as well, but like you use Skyrim if you were playing Skyrim, for example, because there's been a reissue of Skyrim. if you're playing using Steam or GOG to download your games onto your computer. And we also have internet gaming. Think of massive multiplayer online role-playing games, mobile gaming, things like that. Now, obviously, there is intersection between these, especially as we go forward, but these are kind of like the simplest ways to delineate between them. So when video games first started, again, they were way too big to have in your home, just like computers. So for the longest time, they were going to be in arcades. So you would go to the game to play it. You would have multiple, usually coin-operated games that would be together. And that's the kind of most basic way that gaming became exposed to the wider world. And again, at this point, it's you going to the game rather than the game coming to you. So it wasn't quite as mass in terms of mass media, nowhere near the same amount of people would do it, but it was a relatively cheap and popular way to spend your leisure time. Penny arcades were kind of the first popularized version of this, and it was the first real, like, modern, and I mean that in the time period sense, place where people could go. They would usually be they would put them in places like at the end of the train line so that people could get to them easily if they were suburban or if you were urban. And these places, by kind of congregating lots of different types of technology, actually shape a lot of different technologies, not just digital gaming. We get into things like jukeboxes, which are obviously like your kind of really old school precursors to being able to have an iPod or play on Spotify. You had the original versions of movies there, and in fact, the first movie theaters pop up in the exact same places. And so we have things like pinball machines. So even before we get into the digital side of gaming, we have analog physical games that would be coin operated that people would go and play. Now, it's also funny to me that Penny Arcade also has become the name of a popular webcomic that was started in the late 1990s, still running to this day. And the people who started that webcomic are extremely shrewd in terms of using the internet and using media and all the different avenues in order to build their empire. So it's gone beyond just being a webcomic. But they are the ones who came up with the Child's Play nonprofit. You might have seen it's, for example, they have marathons where people will play a game for 24 hours and stream it live in order to raise money. They also are people behind the PAX Expos. PAX East, for example, happens in Boston every year. And PAX stands for Penny Arcade Expo. So again, we'll talk about the kind of like offline side of gaming as well. But they also have their own video games around their webcomic. And they ran a reality TV series where they helped webcomic artists try to break into the business side of things as well. So from the most old school to the most new school in terms of using the term penny arcade. So it's interesting to see how these things impact contemporary culture still. So the next set of slides, the next video, we're going to get from that emergence. We've got our tech. So now, as we get more contemporary, people are going to be able to get into people's homes. We're going to be able to get small. And so how do we then capitalize on that in order to become a mass media?